Hello, my name is Jeff Rolka. I want to thank you for checking out my video. I haven't done a Tools of the Trade video in a very long time. And I recently decided to upgrade to an SSL SiX mixing console for video production in the studio. So what I'm going to do in this video is talk to you a bit about the price of this thing, the functionality of the basic channel strip, the monitoring options and cues, which are a big reason why I decided to make the upgrade. Some impressions on the routing and the functionality of the unit. I'm going to compare and contrast it a little bit with my old console, the Mackie 1202 VLZ3, so you can hear some differences in tone qualities and things like that, and then give you my final thoughts on who might most benefit from this device and why, ultimately, I'm actually quite thrilled with it and am just absolutely agog with the thing. So I'm going to dive right in here. Thank you if you've chosen to subscribe. It's worth mentioning in this video, I've bought all this stuff. I am not sponsored by SSL, Mackie, or anybody else that I might mention in the video. So these thoughts, views, and experiences are purely my own, and I tender them to you in the hopes that it will help you to decide if taking the plunge on a device like this is right for you and for your studio applications. Also, two final thoughts here. One, if you want to support my channel, you can find out about that in the description. Thank you. Sharing and subscribing are super helpful too. Two, once I get us focused on the SSL SiX and the Mackie, I'm going to be routing all of my audio through those devices so that you can continue to get a flavor for what it sounds like to just have a voice going through these things and the different ways that the parameters that I select impact the quality of the voice. The lavalier mic that you're seeing right here right now is not on. You're hearing me through the camera audio. And I wouldn't normally do that, but I did that as a baseline so you can just get a sense of, I don't know, something just baseline. Not the SSL, not the Mackie, just the straight up microphone on the camera. I will try to stay out of the weeds as much as I can in this video, and because of that, it's not going to be the ultimate, absolute, most comprehensive takedown on either of these devices. Because if you really wanted to get into the routing and the options and all the various ways that you can patch things through with them, you could go on and on and on. But I want to give you some quick thoughts, quick experiences, and with that, let's get into this thing. The only thing I've done differently now is that you're hearing me through the SSL, and I've got basically my normal setup engaged on the device. And I did this just so you could hear the sound of a $1,500 upgrade to the studio. That's right, these things cost $1,500. You might ask, oh, well, at that price, you must have a load of preamps. Nope. Two main ones on the channels, and you can very craftily route the talkback microphone preamp back into the mixing console to get a third preamp on this thing. But no, two pre's on the channels. Two mono channels. I mean, they have stereo panning, but it's only one signal coming in. And two stereo channels. I mean, they have a left and a right output. Each of the left channels is normalized, so if you just plug in a single cable into the left channel, it automatically gets sent to both sides of the stereo field, so you get a mono signal. $1,500. You can get a Soundcraft Signature 12 MTK for $499, I believe, $500. Or, if you prefer Allen and Heath, you can get a ZFX10, I think for $3 and some change. So why would you pay 3 times that amount? In the Soundcraft, I think has 8 preamps on it, and the Allen and Heath has 4. Why would you sink that much more money into this device? And furthermore, both the Allen and Heath and the Soundcraft both have onboard effects, and they both have audio interface capabilities. So you can take a USB cable and plug them into your computer, and you can record straight off the deck. Well, why? Why go that much more for this device. Mostly, and I'm going to come back around to this, but it boils down to 3 words: release ready audio. Of all the devices and of all the different routing options, of all the different ways of going from the analog world to the digital domain, this device, in my opinion, gets you from start to finish with the least number of steps and variables in that sequence. So, for example, neither the ZFX nor the Soundcraft have any inline channel compression. Neither of them have a stereo bus compressor either. Now, true, the Soundcraft has a limiter on channels 1 and 2 of the Signature 12 MTK. But limiting is a little bit different than compression. And the differences between the two become very important when you think about your application. And ultimately, when we get to the end here, I'm going to be talking about my application. But why that much? It's a lot of money for what amounts to 4 channels. Now, if you're going to do out-of-box summing, then that changes things quite a lot. And because of the way the console is created with all the various discrete pathways, you can get 6 stereo channels coming into the device. And there's more on that later too, because that's not exactly 6 right out of the box. It's quite a few, but not quite 6. So we'll talk about that later as well. But for starters, the unit's expensive. However, I think it fills this very specific and small niche in the market of small mixing consoles that get you from the analog world to release-ready audio in just the smallest amount of time that you possibly can. So let's have a closer look at this thing, and I'll show you what's on the channel strip. Right off the bat on the SSL, you can see that your inputs are here along the top section. Microphone input. This is the headphone output, which would be for the engineering station. So like the person running the console would be monitoring from here. The other cues come off the back, and we'll get to that in just a second. Before we even get to that, it's worth mentioning that the SSL console has a 5-pin power cord that looks an awful lot like a microphone cable that clips into place quite securely, and it's really quite nice. The downside to that is that if you left it at home and you were using this for a gig, you could really be in trouble. Whereas the Mackie, on the other hand, has this very typical kind of computer power cable, which are fairly common. And you could probably rustle up if you were out on a gig and didn't have it. Pretty typical kind of stuff. Phantom power is currently engaged. You have a high-pass filter. You have a line input. I learned the hard way that if I engage this, you don't get any audio that comes through, and it's going to reintegrate everything there. And I did that kind of, probably shouldn't have done that, but there you go. The line level cuts off the phantom and mic signal coming in. Both of these channels have high Z inputs, so if you wanted to record your acoustic guitar and you don't have a direct box, then you can plug straight in here, engage the high Z button, and it has a built-in circuit that acts as a direct box. So one might argue that right there, this particular availability eliminates the necessity of having extra DI boxes for your studio setup, thereby saving you a couple $100 if you had 1 or 2 DI or something like that. Moving down the channel strip, you have your gain or trim if you prefer, your 1-knob compressor. It is currently engaged. If I disengage it, then you'll hear me without that. It still sounds actually quite lovely. And there it is back again. It's fixed at a 2-to-1 ratio, so you're going to have to hit this thing extremely hard if you're going to get any kind of pumping or compression artifacts. As I sweep it from the least amount of compression and I keep on sweeping it back up, check, 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 you'll hear it work harder and harder on the vocal there, and I'll bring it down to about here. One might argue that a one-knob compressor is not going to serve every single function that you might have, and that I think is absolutely fair and true. However, with a one-knob compressor fixed at a 2-to-1 ratio, this would mean that if you were doing a recording session, you could kind of just make sure you're not going to clip anything without really getting all that much compression and doing more of it later on when you're doing mix down in the DAW. On the other hand, right now you're also hearing me through the G-Series stereo bus compressor. By engaging this, I'm getting much closer to a sound level that is always right at unity, right at 0 dB. Whether I'm speaking to you in a more normal voice, or if I were going to get more excited and talk louder or do anything like that, it's not going to let me get too loud. EQ is here, and it's currently not in line. I will bring it to the center dot and turn it on, so that's the sound with it in circuit, and that's the sound with it out of the circuit. And it has fixed ratios that are meant to be dynamic according to SSL. Right now it's functioning in a shelf capacity, so if I go up like this, you're going to hear that high frequency come up more, and down it's going to dull it up a little bit. This one you probably won't hear too terribly much because my voice is outside the range of where most of that is taking place. If I use it in a bell fashion, then you're meant to get a more kind of bell-like response, an even response across the spectrums. One of the things that I think is most powerful about this particular unit are the Q sends. The Qs are your headphones, your monitors, what you would send to your artists. And the availability of 2 separate Q sends allows for 2 different people with headphones on to have their own specific mix, comprised of your 4 channels, as well as some external inputs that can be filtered in here. So this is your Q section that controls volume to the foldback outputs, the Q outputs, so that's channel 1 and channel 2. These are all stereo, and you don't just have to use them for headphones. You could just as easily use these to send to external effects processors, or to a recording system, or let your mind and imagination take you away. What's even cooler about all this is that from our monitor section over here, and this section is what's feeding this. So your engineer sat here can quickly monitor the main bus, which is what we're doing right now. If I had anything plugged into external 1 or 2, I could monitor that here as well. But let's say we've got an artist here on Q1, and they are engaged. Now when I do this, it's going to throw everything to the left-hand side once I check their mix. So I can do that and hear that everything is over on the left. And I can also do the same thing with Q2, and this will be on the right-hand side. So that brings everything over to the right. And now everything's back into the center because I'm currently monitoring the stereo bus. So if you had this in your studio, then you might have your guitar player on Q1 and your bass player on Q2, and you can send their mix out to them via the foldback monitor section. And then guitar player says, hey, I need more or less of X, Y, Z. Then you can switch over to their cue, make the adjustment, and get an idea of what they like, and then go back to monitoring the stereo bus so you make sure you're getting good signal into your recording device. I think that's important as an engineer because it gives you a feel for what your clients, the people with whom you're working, or if it's just your friends, it smooths everything over as you get more and more accustomed to hearing what they want to hear and adjusting the mix to make it so that they're happy, and when they're happy, you can all be happy and make great music, which is, of course, the point of this whole thing. You'll notice there are these alt input buttons here on channels 1 and 2. Those are additional stereo inputs so that if you were using this system for out-of-box summing, you could engage these, plug stereo inputs into them, and then adjust the level going to the stereo bus via these potentiometers. This is great if you're out-of-box summing and you got loads of stereo pairs coming in. For my purposes right now, it's not really anything that I'm going to be using very much of, but it is nice to have more about that as we get further into this thing. Moving still further down the line, you have the insert, which you can engage, and this allows you to put another inline compressor or some other outboard equipment. One of the things about this system that I thought was lovely, but very much an indulgence, was the 100mm fader. SSL claims that the quote-unquote law around the fader makes it more sensitive around unity. I'll take their word for it. But as someone who has worked in studios before and has grown accustomed to having a fader where I expect to have a fader, as opposed to on the Mackie where you have potentiometers, it's really nice to be able to quickly look over at the system, see where the fader's at, and know that I'm basically in the ballpark of where I want to be. I find that to be very, very comforting. At this point now, you've been able to listen to my voice for quite some time on the SSL. Let's switch over to the Mackie. I'm not going to go into as great a depth on the Mackie and its different functions because, one, it's an antiquated system anyway. I don't even know if you can buy, I'm pretty sure you can't buy 1202 VLZ3s any longer, but it will give you a flavor of what it sounds like as opposed to what this sounds like, because one of the big selling points on these systems is the one knob compressor that's inline, but more than that is even the super analog circuitry that is fueling this mic pre. And further to that end, here's the sound of my voice, and I'm going to give it a bit of a boost here on the fader and on the stereo bus so you get me closer to unity with the camera, just so you can hear my voice without anything else in the signal chain. It's just my AT Pro 70 lavalier mic coming straight in. Phantom power is engaged, but there's no compression here on the channel. There's no stereo bus compressor. There's no EQ engaged. Nothing else is engaged. You're just hearing the lav mic, which is what I'll be giving you over on the Mackie as well. Now you're hearing me on the Mackie, and it looks like I'm coming in a little bit hotter than what I thought it, so I'm going to back this down ever so slightly and get us into roughly the same range as the SSL was coming in. There is nothing in the EQ right now. The gain, you'll see, is pretty high up in order to get the mic hot enough to get me close to unity on the console and everything. And we've got our channel volume up to that, and we've got the main mix up to there too. One of the main reasons why I decided to move over to the SSL was to do with the cues on it versus the aux sends on the Mackie. Because at first glance, you might say, well, there's two aux sends here on the Mackie, and they're balanced, but they're not stereo. They have stereo returns, but the actual sends themselves are mono. So, in order to get separate headphone mixes that are different from your stereo bus, which I didn't say when I was talking about the SSL, but all of those cues on the SSL, when you heard me going between them and the main bus, they were all different, right? Stereo Q2 was panned hard right, stereo Q1 was panned hard left, and I was toggling between them by engaging the buttons, and when I wasn't engaging those, I was back on the main stereo bus. So we have three discrete mixes working through the system all simultaneously. With the Mackie, I can control my sources and get different sounds to the headphones. However, if I want a different overall mix, then I need to use the aux sends. And to get that in stereo, I have to use both of them. Now, that won't be a problem if all you're doing is using the Mackie for a single headphone send. If you have two people that each want their own separate headphone sends, then you either need to get separate headphone monitors that will operate in mono and use them that way. So you could use aux 1 for headphone 1 functioning in mono, and an aux 2 for headphone 2, again functioning in mono. But again, you're going to need a separate headphone amp for this aux and a separate headphone amp for this aux in order to get all those different mixes. Now, true, in theory, you probably ought to use a separate headphone amplifier for each of the two cues coming off the back of the SSL, but the SSL manual indicates that you don't in fact have to. So in theory, this stands alone, whereas this requires still even more hardware in order to get that level of functionality from the unit. Mackie preamps are often much maligned. I don't find them to be all that bad. I mean, I guess I hear a difference, but I don't think of it as something that's terribly bad or terribly good. I guess if I were going to be critical of it, it just sounds a little bit flat to me. It doesn't sound as vibrant as I did even with everything disengaged on the SSL. If I were going to be a little bit more critical about it, there's a certain edge to it that I feel like I can hear. And that might just be my ears now. Just to get a sense of the EQ sweeps here, there's the high range and there's attenuating it. Here's the mid range and there's attenuating it. And again, the low range, maybe it will soften me up a little bit, but not too terribly much because I'm not really down there. And finally, your pans to the right and to the left. And of course, your mute button means I'm muted and you can't hear what I'm saying anyway. Now, just so that we're all clear here, you're hearing me back on the SSL, and it looks like I'm tapping out a little bit higher, so I'm going to just back that down ever so slightly so I'm not crushing you with volume. A couple summarizing thoughts, and then let me tell you why I would choose this device again and why I'm very happy to be using it now for what I do. But before I do that, some caution items here. The threshold on the channel compressors, the threshold goes from +10 to -20 as you go clockwise, which is to say you get more and more compression as you go clockwise by lowering the threshold at which the compressor takes effect. The G-Series bus compressor works just the opposite. It has -20 on the left and +20 on the right, which is a more typical way of having your potentiometer for your compressor threshold. But I found that to be a little bit funny. I mean, it makes sense when you think about compression as an effect. If you think about it that way, then clockwise means more. It's just that it's contrary to the way that most compressors' thresholds work. So if you do go into this, don't be surprised by that if you notice it. I mentioned about the alt inputs for the cues, and I mentioned about the inserts, and there was something I was going to mention about that at the end of this video, or as we got to the end, which we're getting close here. And that is that those are only accessible if you purchase DB25 connectors. So all the inputs and outputs I've shown you thus far on the unit are all typical XLR or TRS tip ring sleeve or mono 1/4 inch cables. But the inserts and the alt inputs for the cues, as well as a few other additional ins and outs for the unit, are all only accessed through the DB25 connectors. So if you really want to get this device as an out-of-box summing unit, then you're probably going to need those cables before you're going to be able to do all the stereo pairs that you wish to do. And that means about another 300 to 400 bones on top of the 1500 you may have shelled out for it initially. So this unit goes from being a $1,500 unit to closer to a $2,000 unit. And depending on where you live, if you're in the US, you're going to add tax on top of that. So you could easily get over $2,000 if you really need to have the DB25 connectors. Now the good news is that these units do go on sale. I did not pay that much. I got this on sale. So you don't have to pay the MSRP, but you may have to wait to get it if you decide that it's right for you. So why would it be right for you? For me, and I can really only speak for myself on this one, it just boiled down to the least amount of steps between analog and done. In my previous setup, I was going through all kinds of outboard preamps and outboard stereo bus compressors, and I was utilizing the Mackie's mute alternate outputs. So when you mute a channel on a Mackie, it sends it to alternate outputs 3 and 4 to route audio out to then go through the stereo bus compressor and come back in. And it still wasn't as good as when I plugged the SSL in, turned it on, kind of got the settings where I thought they ought to be, and then did a bit of recording and listened back to it, and was immediately thrilled with what I was hearing and was immediately convinced that I'd made the right choice. I think that this device is really great for people who are doing interviews, podcasts with 1 or 2 individuals where you have a few sound sources that you want to have as even a volume response as you possibly can. So for my applications, I want people to be able to very clearly hear me when I am speaking, but not get blown away when I open my mouth to sing a scale or something that I'm demonstrating in one of the videos. Using the channel compressors in conjunction with the stereo bus compressor gives me a very nice, even dynamic response from start to finish, and it makes the entire video that much easier to understand and work along with, which is of course the point of what I'm doing here on YouTube. So it was really important to me. None of the other consoles had that combination. The Allen & Heath didn't, the Soundcraft didn't. I cannot think of a console, and I looked at so many of them, that answered the question of dynamics and dynamic processing on the channel as well as a stereo bus compressor on the stereo bus. Now, I already have an outboard stereo bus compressor, and the Allen & Heaths have an insert right off the master bus, so I could have put that in line. But one of the other things that I have always tried to solve for is consistency. And with this system, I can use one recall sheet, have all of my settings archived. So if I switch roles from one video to another, I can very quickly and easily recall all my settings and get consistent results time and time again. So if you are in a situation where you typically work with only a couple individuals or sound sources at one time, where you want in general an even dynamic response, where recallability is a high priority. In other words, I'm going to switch roles and then I need to reset in order to then do it again or change it, so on and so forth. I really think that this is a great choice. So far, the audio processing and the audio routing that I've utilized for it has been exceptionally clean. I just don't hear anything. When I was getting to know the device and learning about it, I fried my ears a couple times just because I was switching the routing and I didn't really know what I was doing yet. And I would engage one button and then say something only to realize that the channel was pegged, like really, really loud. But there's no signs of hissing or any kind of artifacts like that that you would typically hear with a channel that's that hot, that's really, really turned up that loud. I've only had it for a couple weeks, but it has been delightful to work with, and I feel extremely good about it, and I'm very, very happy for not only the sound quality, but also the way that it has made things so much easier and smoother and more consistent in the studio and in the production of the videos that I do. I know it's not entirely exhaustive. I expect that there may be more questions than answers about this, and if I can be of any service, drop a comment or get in touch with me via Twitter or my website, jeffrolka.com. You can send a message to me through the contact sheet there. As always, I hope this helps. My name's Jeff. Take really good care of your voices. Take good care in the studio. Have fun. Make good music. And hopefully we'll see you again. Bye.